France, August 7th, 1944. The dirt road outside Mortagne shuddered under the weight of advancing armour. Sergeant William McBride squinted through the vision slit of his Sherman, watching the tree line ahead ripple with movement. His gunner, Corporal James Hastings, had the traverse wheel in one hand, his other hovering near the firing lever. The tank rocked forward at 15 miles per hour, suspension groaning over the rutted road. Then McBride saw it. The unmistakable angular profile of a Panzer IV emerging from behind a stone barn, 400 yards distant. Every manual, every training session at Fort Knox, had drilled the same procedure into American tank crews. Stop, stabilize, acquire target, fire. But McBride had learned something in the hedgerows that no manual taught. Stopping meant dying. Target, traverse right, Panzer, 400 yards. McBride barked into the intercom. Fire on the move. Hastings didn't hesitate. The turret whined as it rotated, the 75mm gun swinging toward the German tank. The Sherman lurched over a pothole. Hastings compensated instinctively, his hand adjusting elevation even as the hull pitched. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. Through the smoke and dust, McBride watched the tracer arc toward the Panzer. The round struck low, penetrating the German tank's side armour just above the track. The Panzer shuddered, black smoke erupting from its engine deck. The German crew never fired a shot. McBride's hands were shaking as he keyed the radio. Able 3 to Able 6. Panzer destroyed. We never stopped moving. The response crackled back almost immediately. Good kill, Able 3. Keep moving. Always keep moving. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What McBride and thousands of American tank crews were discovering in the summer of 1944 would fundamentally alter armoured warfare. They were learning to shoot while moving, a technique German doctrine considered impossible, British training deemed ineffective, and American manuals barely acknowledged. Yet, in the crucible of Normandy's killing fields, Sherman crews were making the impossible routine. They were hitting targets at combat ranges while travelling at speeds that should have made accurate gunnery laughable. The transformation didn't happen by design. It emerged from desperation, refined through blood, and validated by an unexpected truth. The Sherman tank, maligned for its thin armour and inadequate gun, possessed one feature its designers never advertised, and its crews initially never appreciated. It could shoot accurately while moving in ways no other tank of the war could match. This is the story of how American ingenuity, mechanical engineering, and the unbreakable will to survive turned a supposed weakness into a devastating tactical advantage. It's the story of crews who rewrote doctrine in real time, mechanics who understood their machines better than the engineers who built them, and a simple truth that would echo through armoured warfare for generations. Speed isn't just about getting to the battle faster. Sometimes, speed is the battle. The roots of this transformation stretched back to decisions made in Detroit and Aberdeen, years before the first Sherman rolled onto a European battlefield. The medium tank M4, which the British christened the Sherman after the Civil War general, entered production in February 1942. Its design reflected American industrial philosophy: reliability over complexity, maintainability over maximum performance, production volume over individual superiority. The Sherman's suspension system was the key, though few realized it at the time. American engineers had selected a vertical volute spring suspension, known as VVSS. Each bogie assembly consisted of 2 road wheels mounted on a vertical volute spring. The system was simple, robust, and critically, provided excellent stability across rough terrain. The British, by contrast, used coil springs in their Cromwell tanks. The Germans employed torsion bars in their Panthers and Tigers. Both systems were theoretically superior in some respects, but the American VVSS had one characteristic that would prove decisive. It dampened vertical movement exceptionally well. The Sherman's engine placement contributed to stability in ways designers hadn't fully anticipated. The radial Continental R975 gasoline engine sat at the rear of the hull. This rearward weight distribution, combined with the relatively low-profile turret, created a center of gravity that resisted pitching during acceleration and braking. The tank didn't nosedive when the driver hit the brakes. It didn't rear up excessively when accelerating. It remained surprisingly level. The turret traverse mechanism was another overlooked advantage. The Sherman used a hydraulic traverse system powered by the main engine. It could rotate the turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds, substantially faster than German tanks relying on electrical or manual systems. More importantly, the hydraulic system provided smooth, controlled movement. There were no jerks or stutters. The gunner could track moving targets with precision even while the hull was in motion. The gun mounting itself featured a design element few appreciated initially. The 75mm M3 gun was mounted in a combination gun mount that allowed 9 degrees of elevation and 10 degrees of depression. The mount used a vertical stabilizer, technically designated the Westinghouse gyro stabilizer. This device, primitive by later standards, used a gyroscope to detect vertical movement of the gun and automatically adjusted elevation to compensate. The stabilizer was not sophisticated. It could only compensate for vertical pitch, not horizontal yaw, roll. It drifted out of alignment and required constant adjustment. Many crews disabled it entirely, finding it more trouble than useful. But for crews who learned to work with it, maintain it properly, and understand its limitations, the stabilizer provided something no German or British tank possessed: the ability to keep the gun roughly on target even while the hull bounced over rough terrain. Lieutenant Colonel William Orr, who commanded the 32nd Armoured Regiment, recognized the potential early. In a training memorandum dated March 1944, preserved in the National Archives, Orr wrote to his battalion commanders, "The M4's vertical stabilizer has been largely ignored in training. Crews report it unreliable and prefer to fire from static positions. However, European terrain will not always permit us to choose our firing positions. We must develop techniques for engaging targets while moving. The stabilizer, properly maintained and understood, may provide critical advantages in fluid combat situations." Orr's insight was prescient, but translating it into doctrine proved difficult. American tank training in 1943 and early 1944 emphasized accuracy from static positions. Gunnery ranges featured stationary tanks engaging stationary targets at known ranges. Moving targets were introduced gradually, but the tank itself always fired from a hull-down or stopped position. The concept of firing accurately while the tank moved at speed was simply not part of the curriculum. The reasoning was sound based on existing technology. Hitting a target required stable platform. Any movement introduced variables that degraded accuracy. German doctrine reflected this understanding. Panzer crews were trained to stop, acquire target, fire, and then reposition. The process was methodical and, against properly executed, devastatingly effective. German gunners were trained to extraordinary standards. They could estimate range, accurately, compensate for target movement, and achieve first-round hits at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. British doctrine similarly emphasized firing from static positions. The Churchill tank, though slow, was designed to advance to a firing position, stop, and engage with its excellent 17-pounder gun when equipped with that weapon. Speed was less important than bringing superior firepower to bear from prepared positions. American doctrine existed somewhere between these extremes. American tanks were expected to be mobile, to maneuver aggressively, and to use speed to compensate for armor deficiencies. But the actual firing was still expected to occur from stopped positions. The tank would race to a position, halt, fire, and then move again. Movement and firing were separate phases, not simultaneous actions. This doctrine worked adequately in training and in the early North African campaigns where the terrain was relatively open and sight lines extended for miles. But Normandy would shatter these assumptions. The hedgerow country of northwestern France, locally called the Bocage, consisted of small fields bounded by ancient earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation. These hedgerows, some dating back to Roman times, created a claustrophobic battlefield where sightlines rarely exceeded 200 yards. Tank crews arriving in Normandy in June and July of 1944 discovered that their training had not prepared them for this environment. The narrow lanes between hedgerows became shooting galleries. German anti-tank guns, positioned behind hedgerows with perfect concealment, could destroy approaching tanks at point-blank range. Panthers and Panzer IVs, hull down behind earthen banks, waited for American tanks to expose themselves, climbing over hedgerows. The standard American tactic of racing to a position and then stopping to fire proved suicidal. A stopped tank was a dead tank. German gunners needed only seconds to acquire and engage a stationary target. The Sherman's relatively thin armour provided minimal protection against German anti-tank weapons at these close ranges. Casualties were horrific. The 2nd Armoured Division lost 128 tanks destroyed in the first 5 weeks after D-Day. The 3rd Armoured Division suffered similarly. Tank crews began referring to their Shermans as Ronsons after a popular cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised "lights first time, every time." The nickname was darkly accurate. When a Sherman was penetrated, it frequently caught fire immediately. Crew survival rates were grim. A tank penetrated by an 88mm round or a Panzerfaust rocket often erupted in flames before crews could escape. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, the 3rd Armoured Division's maintenance officer, documented the carnage in meticulous detail. His records showed that in the first month of combat, over 60% of Shermans knocked out, burned completely. The majority of crews in these tanks died. The psychological toll was immense. Crews climbed into their tanks each morning knowing the odds were against them. Some crews refused to button up, preferring to ride with hatches open despite vulnerability to small arms fire. The reasoning was brutal but logical. Better to risk a bullet wound than burn alive in a sealed steel coffin. Yet even in this nightmare, adaptation began. Crews who survived their first engagements started developing techniques that violated doctrine but kept them alive. They learned to never stop moving in contested areas. They learned to fire on the move, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for survival. They learned to trust the stabilizer their training had taught them to ignore. Sergeant Frank Griffin of the 66th Armoured Regiment described the evolution in a letter home dated July 23, 1944. "We don't fight by the book anymore. The book gets you killed. We keep moving, always moving. Our gunner, Danny, can hit targets at 300 yards while we're doing 15 miles per hour over rough ground. The brass would say it's impossible. We've done it 20 times this week. The Germans expect us to stop. They're trained to wait for us to stop. When we don't, when we just keep coming and keep shooting, they miss their first shot, and you don't get a second shot against 5 Shermans." The mechanics and technical reality behind this emerging capability would prove as important as the courage implementing it. But first, crews had to unlearn everything they'd been taught and learn to trust their tanks in ways no manual suggested. The Sherman's gyrostabilizer was a temperamental device, but it worked on principles that were elegant in their simplicity. A spinning gyroscope resists changes to its orientation. The Westinghouse system used this principle to detect when the tank's hull pitched up or down. When pitch was detected, the stabilizer automatically adjusted the gun's elevation to compensate, theoretically keeping the gun pointed at the target despite hull movement. The system had significant limitations. It only stabilized the vertical axis. If the tank rolled side to side or yawed in a turn, the stabilizer did nothing. It also had a limited range of compensation. If the hull pitched too violently, the stabilizer couldn't keep up and would disengage. The gyroscope itself required time to spin up to operating speed. It drew power from the tank's electrical system. If the system lost power, even momentarily, the gyroscope would slow and the stabilizer would become unreliable. Most critically, the stabilizer didn't aim the gun. It simply kept the gun approximately on target while the tank moved. The gunner still had to acquire the target, estimate range, and make the final adjustments for wind, target movement, and ammunition characteristics. The stabilizer reduced the variables but didn't eliminate them. Many American crews in the early months of combat disabled the stabilizer entirely. They found it unpredictable. It would work perfectly for days, then suddenly fail at a critical moment. The gyroscope required careful maintenance, and maintenance time was always scarce in combat conditions. Electrical connections corroded, hydraulic lines leaked. The system seemed more trouble than it was worth. But a minority of crews persisted with the stabilizer. They learned its quirks and worked within its limitations. They discovered that proper maintenance made it reliable, clean electrical connections, check hydraulic fluid levels daily, allow the gyroscope to spin up to full speed before entering combat. These simple procedures dramatically improved performance. These crews also learned techniques for compensating for the stabilizer's limitations. They learned to anticipate turns and adjust aim before the tank yawed. They learned to fire during moments when the hull was relatively level, even if the tank was still moving forward. They learned to work with their drivers, coordinating movement with firing opportunities. The relationship between driver and gunner became critical. A skilled driver could smooth the ride, avoiding the worst bumps, taking turns gradually, accelerating and decelerating smoothly. These subtle driving techniques kept the hull more stable and made the stabilizer more effective. Drivers learned to call out terrain features. Big bump in 3 seconds, turning left in 5. These verbal cues allowed gunners to prepare and time their shots. By August 1944, some Sherman crews had become remarkably proficient at firing on the move. They weren't achieving the accuracy they could from a stopped position. First-round hit probability dropped from perhaps 70% when stopped to maybe 30 or 40% when moving. But in the bocage, a 40% chance of hitting while moving beat a 0% chance of surviving if you stopped. The technique spread organically. Veterans shared lessons with replacement crews. Commanders who saw the effectiveness encouraged their units to practice. Gradually, firing on the move transitioned from desperate improvisation to accepted tactic. Technical Sergeant Raymond Klink, a gunnery instructor reassigned to the 3rd Armored Division after the invasion, documented the evolution in after-action reports. Crews are achieving hits on moving targets while themselves moving at speeds up to 20 miles per hour, he wrote in August. Effective range is limited to approximately 400 yards. Beyond that distance, dispersion becomes too great for reliable hits, but within 400 yards, trained crews are hitting 60 to 70% of the time. This represents a fundamental shift in how we employ armor. The mathematics of firing on the move were complex but calculable. When a tank moved at 15 miles per hour, it traveled 22 feet per second. The 75mm M3 gun had a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,000 feet per second. At a range of 300 yards, flight time was roughly half a second. During that half second, the firing tank traveled 11 feet. If the gunner aimed directly at the target and fired, the shell would miss because by the time it arrived, the firing tank would have moved. The gunner had to aim slightly ahead of where the gun barrel was actually pointed, compensating for the tank's forward movement. This required instinct more than calculation. Gunners couldn't do trigonometry in their heads during combat. They learned through practice and repetition, developing muscle memory for the correct lead. Target movement added another layer of complexity. If the target was also moving, the gunner had to lead both his own tank's movement and the target's movement. This was extraordinarily difficult and explained why moving target to moving target engagements rarely resulted in first-round hits. But German tanks, particularly Panthers and Tigers, rarely moved during engagements. German doctrine emphasized fighting from prepared positions. The heavy German tanks were slower and less maneuverable than Shermans. Their transmissions were complex and prone to breakdown. German crews were trained to find a good position, preferably hull down, and fight from there. This created an asymmetry American crews learned to exploit. The Sherman would keep moving, making it a difficult target. The German tank would be stationary, making it a predictable target. Even if the Shermans' accuracy was reduced by movement, the Germans' accuracy was also reduced because they were firing at a moving target. And critically, the Sherman fired first. The psychological advantage was as important as the tactical one. German crews were trained to expect American tanks to stop before firing. When Shermans kept moving and kept shooting, it disrupted German decision-making. Should they wait for the American tank to stop, as doctrine predicted? Should they fire at the moving target immediately, reducing accuracy? The hesitation, even for a few seconds, often proved fatal. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain James Burt of the 66th Armored Regiment, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for actions at Aachen, described the tactical evolution in a training memorandum circulated in September 1944. The Sherman's ability to engage targets while moving provides 3 distinct advantages. Burt wrote, "First, we fire sooner. We don't waste time stopping and stabilizing. Second, we're harder to hit. A moving target is always more difficult than a stationary one. Third, we control the engagement tempo. The enemy must react to us rather than executing their prepared plan. These advantages outweigh the reduction in first-round hit probability, particularly at ranges under 500 yards. Burt's analysis was being validated daily across the front. Sherman platoons that mastered firing on the move were suffering fewer casualties and destroying more enemy tanks than units still fighting by doctrinal methods. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. But the technique required more than just courage. It required mechanical understanding, crew coordination, and intensive practice. Not every crew could do it effectively. Some gunners simply couldn't acquire and track targets while their hull bounced over rough terrain. Some drivers couldn't smooth their driving enough to give their gunners a stable enough platform. Some stabilizers were too poorly maintained to work reliably. The best crews were those where every man understood his role in making the technique work. The loader had to maintain a steady supply of ammunition, ready to reload instantly after each shot. The assistant driver, who also served as bow gunner, watched for threats and obstacles, calling them out to warn the driver. The tank commander orchestrated everything, selecting targets, directing movement, and timing the engagements. These 5-man crews became organisms, reacting instinctively to battlefield conditions. They developed their own informal procedures and communications. A tap on the gunner's shoulder might mean, "Fire now." A specific tone in the commander's voice might signal urgency. These non-verbal cues allowed faster reactions than formal radio procedure. The bonding between crew members deepened. They lived together, fought together, and depended on each other absolutely. In many units, crews ate together, slept near their tanks, and spent their rare rest periods maintaining their vehicles together. The tank became home, sanctuary, and workplace. Crews gave their tanks names, painted them on the hulls, and developed almost superstitious attachment to specific vehicles. Sergeant William McBride's crew called their Sherman Fury, painted in white letters, near the main gun. "That tank kept us alive," McBride recalled years later. "We maintained it religiously. We knew every sound it made, every vibration, every quirk. When Danny fired on the move, we all felt it. The whole tank was part of the firing solution. If the engine missed a beat, we knew it. If the suspension was getting soft, we felt it. That tank wasn't just a machine. It was the 6th member of our crew." This intimate knowledge of their machines allowed the best crews to push the Sherman to performance levels that surprised even the engineers who designed it. They understood that the tank's capabilities exceeded its official specifications when properly maintained and skillfully operated. The evolution continued through the autumn of 1944 as American armored divisions broke out of Normandy and pursued German forces across France. The more open terrain allowed longer engagement ranges, but the principle of firing on the move remained valid. German defenders, falling back in disorder, rarely had time to establish proper defensive positions. They fought hasty actions from whatever cover they could find. American tank crews, now experienced and confident, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. They moved fast, shot accurately even while moving, and coordinated with infantry and artillery with growing proficiency. The hunting packs of Shermans that had emerged in the bocage now ranged across open country, destroying German resistance wherever they found it. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 provided dramatic validation of these new tactics. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, outnumbered by German Panther tanks, used superior crew training and coordinated movement to destroy 11 Panthers in a single morning engagement, while losing only 1 Sherman. The American crews kept moving throughout the battle, firing on the move, never presenting stationary targets. German after-action reports from Aracourt expressed bewilderment. American tanks engaged while moving at high speed, one report stated. Their accuracy, while moving, was far better than our intelligence had suggested. Our crews found it difficult to engage targets that refused to stop moving. The technique had evolved from desperate improvisation to doctrinal practice. By October 1944, American armored training schools back in the United States were beginning to incorporate firing on the move into their curricula. Instructors interviewed returning veterans and incorporated their lessons into training programs. Technical Bulletin ORD-9, issued in November 1944, officially recognized the technique. The M4 tank's gyrostabilizer, previously considered of marginal utility, has proven highly effective in combat when properly maintained and employed, the bulletin stated. Crews should be trained to engage targets while moving at speeds up to 15 miles per hour, at ranges up to 400 yards. This capability provides significant tactical advantages and should be exploited whenever terrain and tactical situation permit. The bulletin included specific maintenance procedures, gunnery techniques, and tactical guidance based on combat experience from Normandy and France. It represented official acknowledgement that crews in the field had discovered capabilities the designers hadn't fully appreciated and the training establishment hadn't taught. But the true test was yet to come. In December 1944, Germany launched its last desperate offensive in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge would test everything American armor had learned, including the technique of firing on the move that had emerged from the bocage. The Ardennes offensive began on December 16th with 3 German armies attacking through heavily forested terrain in conditions of snow, fog, and bitter cold. German armoured spearheads, including Tiger and King Tiger tanks, achieved surprise and broke through American lines. For several days, German success seemed possible, but the American response demonstrated how thoroughly the army had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare. Within 24 hours, American commanders had identified the threat and begun moving reinforcements. Patton's Third Army disengaged from its offensive operations, turned 90 degrees north, and marched over 100 miles in winter conditions to strike the German southern flank. The movement involved multiple armoured divisions, executed with speed that would have been impossible earlier in the war. And crucially, when these armoured divisions reached the battle, they fought with the techniques developed over months of combat. They kept moving. They fired on the move. They refused to fight by German rules. The 3rd Armoured Division, veterans of Normandy and the pursuit across France, engaged German forces near Hotton. American tank crews, now thoroughly trained in firing while moving, used their mobility to devastating effect. Sherman platoons would race forward, firing at German positions, then peel off before German gunners could respond effectively. The technique, impossible to execute in the close terrain of the bocage, worked brilliantly in the more open Ardennes hills. Staff Sergeant Joseph Merrill described an engagement on December 23rd near Manhay. "We came over a rise and spotted 3 Panthers in a tree line about 600 yards out," he recalled. "Our lieutenant didn't even call a halt. We just kept rolling, all 5 tanks in line abreast. Every gunner fired almost simultaneously while we were still moving. 2 Panthers took hits immediately. The 3rd tried to reverse into cover, but Danny got him with a second shot. The whole engagement lasted maybe 30 seconds. We never stopped moving." The kill-to-loss ratios at the Bulge favoured American armour decisively. In engagement after engagement, Sherman units destroyed German tanks while suffering minimal losses. The reasons were complex: American air superiority, superior logistics, better training, but the ability to shoot accurately while moving contributed significantly. German tank crews, many of them replacements with minimal training, couldn't adapt to American tactics. They'd been trained in traditional methods: stop, acquire, target, fire, reposition. When American tanks refused to stop, German crews struggled. Their targeting solutions assumed stationary targets. Their doctrine assumed predictable enemy behavior. The Americans were providing neither. By January 1945, the German offensive had been contained and reversed. American armored divisions counterattacked, driving German forces back with heavy losses. The Sherman crews, who had learned to fight in Normandy's hedgerows, had now defeated Germany's last major offensive. The cost had been severe. Thousands of American soldiers died in the Bulge. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed. But the American army had demonstrated adaptability and resilience that German forces could no longer match. And one component of that success was the simple fact that American crews could hit targets while moving in ways their enemies couldn't. As winter turned to spring in 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany itself. By this point, German resistance was collapsing. Fuel shortages immobilized much of Germany's remaining armor. Spare parts were non-existent. Trained crews were dead or captured. The few German tanks still operational fought with courage but without hope. American Sherman crews, by contrast, were at the peak of their effectiveness. They had hundreds of hours of combat experience. Their tanks were well maintained and fully supplied. Their tactics had been refined through countless engagements, and they possessed skills that their enemies simply couldn't match. The ability to shoot accurately while moving was just one component of American armored superiority by 1945, but it was a component that symbolized the larger transformation. American crews had taken a tank that was merely adequate on paper and made it devastatingly effective through skill, innovation, and courage. They had turned perceived weaknesses into unexpected strengths. The Sherman would serve far beyond World War II, validating the soundness of its design. In Korea, Shermans equipped American forces and proved effective against North Korean armor. Israeli Shermans, extensively modified with upgraded guns and engines, fought successfully through the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Numerous countries operated Shermans into the 1980s, an extraordinary service life for a design originating in 1941. The legacy extended beyond the tank itself. The lessons learned about stabilized gunnery, firing on the move, and crew coordination would influence tank design for generations. Modern main battle tanks incorporate sophisticated stabilization systems that allow accurate fire while moving at high speed over rough terrain. The principle that Sherman crews pioneered in Normandy's hedgerows, that mobility and firepower could be combined rather than traded against each other, became foundational to armored warfare doctrine. The M1 Abrams tank, named after the same Creighton Abrams who commanded a Sherman battalion in World War II, embodies these lessons. Its advanced stabilization system allows accurate fire while moving at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. Its fire control computer instantly calculates all the variables that World War II gunners had to estimate by instinct. But the underlying principle remains the same. A tank that can shoot accurately while moving dominates one that must stop to fire. The story of how American Sherman crews learned to fire on the move is ultimately a story about human adaptability. Faced with a tactical problem that doctrine didn't solve, crews improvised. Faced with equipment that training dismissed as unreliable, they learned to make it work. Faced with an enemy that seemed technically superior, they found advantages in unexpected places. Sergeant William McBride, who fired that first moving shot outside Mortain in August 1944, survived the war. He returned home to Kansas, worked as a mechanic, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his experiences. But in an oral history interview conducted in 1998, shortly before his death, he reflected on what his crew had learned. "We weren't the best tank in the war," McBride said. "The Germans had better armor, better guns, but we had something they didn't. We could keep moving and keep fighting. Our tank let us do that, once we figured out how. And we had each other. 5 guys who trusted each other completely. That was our advantage. Not the tank, us. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos, on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.